We are Mike and Jeannie, and we restore old houses. In 2021, we moved to South Carolina and bought a 120-year-old Victorian house. Follow along as we put the polish back on this Victorian masterpiece. Welcome back to 1834 Restoration House. It's a beautiful fall day. The skies are clear, leaves are falling, and it's still warm outside, so it's just a real pleasure to be outside here. We're getting a late start today because we were in Atlanta all day yesterday. So today we're going to catch up on some things. And what do we have going?
Cleaning the walls in the upstairs bedroom, the electrical news, and a ghost story.
The final ghost story. This one takes place aboard a ship, a steamship. We have all of the 1834 coffee mugs up here in this room, along with boxes and bubble wrap. And we had no idea how big these bubble wrap rolls were going to be. All they said was it can't be shipped to UPS and has to come by special motor carrier. Okay, well, how bad can that be, right? And then these two things show up. So it looks like we're good to go as far as packaging these mugs.
First thing I want to do is clean out all these boxes and get them out of the room, and then we'll start on wiping down the walls. Since the house was closed up for so many years, a little bit of mold has grown on the wallpaper, so we're going to clean that off today.
Down here in this bucket, I have a solution of trisodium phosphate and hot water. This makes a really good cleaner of walls. It takes off dirt, grease, oils, and it also kills nasty stuff like this mildew up here. See how it's all black? Trisodium phosphate is caustic, which is why I'm wearing a glove, because I don't want that on my skin. This is sold at most hardware stores and big box stores under the name TSP. This wallpaper doesn't really look dirty, but when we start washing it, that's when the dirt really shows up. What we're doing is we're washing about 1 foot down from the top, and then we'll come back with mops and then do the rest of it.
I'll come over here on the other side. This water is getting pretty murky. I think we need to change it out when you get to the halfway mark. What do you think?
We still have a long ways to go.
Oh, black.
Yeah, I think the worst of it though is in the corners, going up and down, and the corners up here along the crown molding.
Yes, all the way around.
I'm not sure why.
Mostly above the windows. Do you notice that?
Yep.
It's not so bad in between the windows.
Yeah, I wonder if we're not getting some dirt through the window cracks. It's the end of October and we have the windows open. What What I'm doing now is applying some TSP with a mop to the wall. Most of what we have here is just dirty, dusty, and the TSP will help to break that down and get it off of there. And then Jeannie's going to come around behind me with another mop that has just plain clear water and rinse off any TSP residue.
O'clock.
2 o'clock, all's well. We've all seen this wallpaper, and by all accounts, it was pretty clean looking, except for a couple of spots that had some mildew at the top. So we changed the water and put some fresh TSP in it, and then we just got done mopping the walls down. Look how dirty that is. Mopping the wall has made quite a mess on the floor. There's water drops everywhere, and the floor is kind of dirty anyway, so we're going to go ahead and mop it. We'll do the same treatment, TSP water first, and then we'll follow up with a clear rinse with the clear water mop. I can feel the grit coming up.
Here is the clean water.
That room always looked pretty clean to us, but you saw that water. That was not clean. Well, folks, I have some good news. Now, last week we applied for a building permit to replace all this electrical here. And about 2 days later, I got a call from the county, and they said, we've approved your permit, and we'll be sending it to you in the mail, but we're going to send you a copy by email. So I went ahead and got that, and we have that. So now that gives us permission to not only buy the parts, but to start building the new system. What does the building permit allow us to do? Great question. What that allows us to do is to go buy the parts, put it together on the wall, and connect it up. What it doesn't allow us to do is connect the utility to it, and it also doesn't allow us to connect it to the house system. So what we do next after that is have the county come back out and inspect it. And so they'll inspect all of our wiring, all of our connections, and make sure everything complies with the National Electrical Code. And then they sign it off, or they tell us that we need to fix this or we need to fix that. But they'll be very specific about what needs to be fixed. Once that's done, the utility company will come out and they'll break the connection up there, and they'll run a new drop if they have to connect to our new panel. And then once that's done, they drop in the meter and then they leave. And then we come back and we make a connection from the new panel to the old panel, and that's where we get our power. I know what you're thinking. Why would we put a brand new breaker panel over here and then connect it up to the old breaker panel over here? And the reason is, this old breaker panel is connected to the entire house's electrical system right now. And we eventually want it all connected up to the new panel over here. So how we do that is we power up this old panel, and that gets everything back online again. Now we can live, we can cook, we can take showers, do all the things that we do when we live here. And then as we have time, we can take one circuit at a time, take a cable to the outlets, or take a cable to the lights, or take a cable to the appliances. One cable at a time, we're going to walk the electrical system off this old panel here and move it onto this panel over here. And then when we get done, everything here will be gone and dead, and we can pull this old system out. This is called the weatherhead, and this is where the utility power comes into the house. So they bring their wires and they connect their wires to our wires, and our wires come down the pipe and into the meter panel. Everything on this side is our responsibility, and everything on that side is the utility's responsibility, except for the meter box. So our wires come down this conduit. This meter here belongs to the utility. This is the first thing the power comes to before it comes in the house. And this measures how much electricity is being used, and that's how they bill you every month, by measuring your electrical usage. Then the power comes out this big cable here, and it goes into the electrical panel. Electrical panels are supposed to have a master breaker right here, and that's to shut down the entire house with one flip. Well, this one is old and it doesn't have that, which is one of the reasons why we're changing this out. It doesn't even come close to modern building code. And then after that breaker come the sub breakers, and these breakers are the ones that cut the power off to different parts of the house. They could go to lights, they could go to plugs, they could go to water heaters, air conditioners, etc. And so that's how we kill those circuits, as individual breakers. The circuits come out of here, they go through these conduits, they drop onto the house, and they go on their merry way. Now, I'd like to show you a couple of interesting things. This wire right here is called a ground wire. And it comes down, and if I can draw your attention to the ground right here, there's a clamp and a little piece of metal. What we can't see here is an 8-foot long rod that's driven deep into the ground. And when you talk about a grounded outlet, it literally is connected to the ground. Now this is really odd because the ground wire is connected into the meter box, but it's not connected to the electrical panel. And that doesn't meet code either. The ground has to go to the electrical panel. Now we've got this other green wire here. This goes over to the telephone box. Okay, that's good, that's legit. But there should also be another wire that goes and connects to the plumbing. There should be another wire that goes and connects to the gas pipes. That's also code. Those have to be connected. And you can see a lot of reasons why this doesn't meet electrical code. And then we have this thing here. What is this? It kind of goes up here and disappears. And then it comes over here to this box. Yeah, this one's actually the phone box. So this one here is phone. This one over here must be cable TV, I'm thinking. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's cable TV. But as you can see, it's a real mess. Nothing was done well. The workmanship is terrible. So there's a lot of work to do here, but we'll clean it up one step at a time, one wire at a time. We're going to make this beautiful. Since we're out here, I want to show you something I found the other day that was really weird. I don't know if we've shown this on camera before, but this is an old-fashioned knife switch mounted on the side of the house, outdoors, completely exposed, and it has a wire here and a wire here, and you could literally walk up and shock yourself if it was energized. But I have no idea what this thing is. We did test it and there's no energy on it, but at some point you could literally walk up and turn something on by flipping that switch. Hopefully the next time you see us, we'll have some electrical parts and we can start putting stuff together. This is the month of October, a month when there's a chill in the air, when leaves dry up and fall off, and then later go skittering down the street in the winds of October. It's also a month when scary stories begin to be told. And it's only fitting that since we live in a Victorian house, that we tell a tale from the Victorian era. Tonight, we tell our final tale for the month of October. Tonight's tale, Stateroom 105. I am an old sailor, said Brisbane. As I have to cross the Atlantic pretty often, I have my favorites. Most men have their favorites. I have seen a man wait in a Broadway bar for 3/4 of an hour for a particular car which he liked. I believe the barkeeper made at least 1/3 of his living by that man's preference. I have a habit of waiting for certain ships when I am obliged to cross that duck pond. It may be prejudice, but I was never cheated out of a good passage but once in my life. I remember it very well. It was a warm morning in June, and the custom house officials, who were hanging about waiting for a steamer already on her way up from the quarantine, presented a peculiarly hazy and thoughtful appearance. I had not much luggage. I never have. I mingled with the crowd of passengers, porters, and officious individuals in blue coats and brass buttons, which seemed to spring up like mushrooms from the back of a moored steamer to obtrude their unnecessary services upon the independent passenger. I have often noticed with a certain interest the spontaneous evolution of these fellows. They are not there when you arrive. 5 minutes after the pilot has called go ahead, they, or at least their blue coats and brass buttons, have disappeared from the deck gangway as completely as though they had been consigned to the locker which the tradition ascribes to Davy Jones. But at the moment of starting, there they are, clean-shaved, blue-coated, and ravenous for fees. I hastened on board. The Kamchatka was one of my favorite ships. I say was, because she emphatically no longer is. I cannot conceive of any inducement that could entice me to make another voyage in her. Yes, I know what you're going to say. She is uncommonly clean in the run aft, and she has enough bluffing off in the bows to keep her dry, and the lower berths are most of them double. She has a lot of advantages, but I won't cross in her again. Excuse the digression. I got on board, hailed the steward, whose red nose and redder whiskers were equally familiar to me. 105 lower berths, said I, in the businesslike tone peculiar to men who think no more of crossing the Atlantic than taking a whiskey cocktail at downtown Delmonico's. The steward took my portmanteau, great rug, and coat. I shall never forget the expression on his face. Not that he turned pale. It is maintained by the most eminent divines that even miracles cannot change the course of nature. I have no hesitation in saying that he did not turn pale, but from his expression I judged that he was either about to shed tears, to sneeze, or to drop my portmanteau. As the latter contained 2 bottles of particularly fine old sherry presented to me for my voyage by my old friend Snigginson Van Pickens. I felt extremely nervous, but the steward did none of these things. I supposed my Hermes, as he led me to the lower regions, had had a little grog, but I said nothing and followed him. 105 was on the port side, well aft. There was nothing remarkable about the stateroom. The lower berth, like most upon the Kamchatka, was double. There was plenty of room. There was the usual washing apparatus, calculated to convey an idea of luxury to the mind of a North American Indian. There was the usual inefficient racks of brown wood in which it is more easy to hand a large-size umbrella than a common toothbrush of commerce. Upon the uninviting mattresses were carefully bolted together those blankets which a great modern humorist has aptly compared to cold buckwheat cakes. The question of towels was left entirely to the imagination. The glass decanters were filled with a transparent brown liquid, from which an odor less faint, but not more pleasing, ascended to the nostrils, like a far-off seasick reminiscence of oily machinery. Sad-colored curtains half closed the upper berth. The hazy June daylight shed a faint illumination upon the desolate little scene. Ugh, how I hate that stateroom. The steward deposited my traps and looked at me as though he wanted to get away, probably in search of more passengers and more fees. It is always a good plan to start in favor with those functionaries, and I accordingly gave him certain coins there and then. "I'll try to make you comfortable all I can," he remarked as he put the coins in his pocket. Nevertheless, there was a doubtful intonation in his voice which surprised me. Possibly his scale of fees had gone up and he was not satisfied, but on the whole I was inclined to think that, as he himself would have expressed it, he was the better for a glass. I was wrong, however, and did the man injustice. Nothing especially worthy of mention occurred during that day. We left the pier punctually, and it was very pleasant to be fairly underway, for the weather was warm and sultry, and the motion of the steamer produced a refreshing breeze. Everybody knows what the first day at sea is like. People pace the decks and stare at each other, and occasionally meet acquaintances whom they did not know to be on board. There is the usual uncertainty as to whether the food will be good, bad, or indifferent, until the first 2 meals have put the matter beyond a doubt. There is the usual uncertainty about the weather until the ship is fairly off Fire Island. The tables are crowded at first, and then suddenly thinned. Pale-faced people spring from their seats and precipitate themselves toward the door, and each old sailor breathes more freely as his seasick neighbor rushes from his side, leaving him plenty of elbow room and an unlimited command over the mustard. One passage across the Atlantic is very much like another, and we who cross very often do not make the voyage for the sake of novelty. Whales and icebergs are indeed always objects of interest, but after all, one whale is much like another whale, and one rarely sees an iceberg at close quarters. To the majority of us, the most delightful moment of the day on board an ocean steamer is when we have taken our last turn on deck, having smoked our last cigar, and having succeeded in tiring ourselves, feel at liberty to turn in with a clear conscience. On that first night of the voyage, I felt particularly lazy and went to bed in 105 rather earlier than I usually do. As I turned in, I was amazed to see that I was to have a companion. A portmanteau, very much like my own, lay in the opposite corner, and in the upper berth had been deposited a neatly folded rug with a stick and umbrella. I had hoped to be alone, and I was disappointed, but I wondered who my roommate was to be, and I determined to have a look at him. Before I had been long in bed, he entered. He was, as far as I could see, a very tall man, very thin, very pale, with sandy hair and whiskers and colorless gray eyes. He had about him, I thought, an air of rather dubious fashion, the sort of man you might see in Wall Street, without being able precisely to say what he was doing there. The sort of man who frequents the Café Anglais, who always seems to be alone and who drinks champagne. You might meet him on a race course, but he would never appear to be doing anything there either. A little overdressed, a little odd. There are 3 or 4 of his kind on every ocean steamer. I made up my mind that I did not care to make his acquaintance, and I went to sleep saying to myself that I would study his habits in order to avoid him. If he rose early, I would rise late. If he went to bed late, I would go to bed early. I did not care to know him. If you once know people of that kind, they are always turning up. Poor fellow. I need not have taken the trouble to come to so many decisions about him, for I never saw him again after the first night in 105. I was sleeping soundly when I was suddenly waked by a loud noise. To judge from the sound, my roommate must have sprung with a single leap from the upper berth to the floor. I heard him fumbling with the latch and bolt of the door, which opened almost immediately, and then I heard his footsteps as he ran full speed down the passage, leaving the door open behind him. The ship was rolling a little, and I expected to hear him stumble or fall, but he ran as though he were running for his life. The door swung open on its hinges with the motion of the vessel, and the sound annoyed me. I got up and shut it, and groped my way back to the berth in the darkness. I went to sleep again, but I have no idea how long I slept. When I awoke, it was still quite dark, but I felt a disagreeable sensation of cold, and it seemed to me that the air was damp. You know the particular smell of a cabin, which has been wet with seawater. I covered myself up as well as I could and dozed off again, framing complaints to be made the next day and selecting the most powerful epithets in the language. I could hear my roommate turn over in the upper berth. He had probably returned while I was asleep. Once I thought I heard him groan, and I argued that he was seasick. That is particularly unpleasant when one is below. Nevertheless, I dozed off and slept till early daylight. The ship was rolling heavily, much more than on the previous evening, and the gray light which came in through the porthole changed in tint with every movement according to the angle of the vessel's side, turned the glass seawards or skywards. It was very cold, unaccountably so for the month of June. I turned my head and looked at the porthole and saw to my surprise that it was wide open and hooked back. I believe I swore audibly. Then I got up and shut it. As I turned back, I glanced at the upper berth. The curtains were drawn close together. My companion had probably felt cold as well as I. It struck me that I had slept enough. The stateroom was uncomfortable, though, strange to say, I could not smell the dampness which had annoyed me in the night. My roommate was still asleep. Excellent opportunity for avoiding him, so I dressed at once and went on deck. The day was warm and cloudy, with an oily smell in the water. It was 7 o'clock as I came out, much later than I had imagined. I came across the doctor who was taking his first sniff of the morning air. He was a young man from the west of Ireland, a tremendous fellow with black hair and blue eyes, already inclined to be stout. He had a happy-go-lucky, healthy look about him, which was rather attractive. "Fine morning," I remarked by way of introduction. "Well," said he, eyeing me with an air of ready interest, "it's a fine morning and it's not a fine morning." "I don't think it's much of a morning." "Well, no, it is not so very fine," said I. "It's just what I call fugly weather," replied the doctor. "It was very cold last night, I thought," I remarked. "However, when I looked about, I found that the porthole was wide open. I had not noticed it when I went to bed, and the stateroom was damp, too." "Damp," said he. "Whereabouts are you?" 105. To my surprise, the doctor started visibly and stared at me. "What is the matter?" I asked. "Oh, nothing," he answered. "Only everybody who has complained of that stateroom for the last 3 trips." "I shall complain too," I said. "It has certainly not been properly aired. It's a shame." "I don't believe it can be helped," answered the doctor. "I believe there is something. Well, it's not my business to frighten passengers." "You need not be afraid of frightening me," I replied. "I can stand any amount of damp. If I should get a bad cold, I will come to you." I offered the doctor a cigar, which he took and examined very critically. "It's not so much the damp," he remarked. "However, I dare say you will get on very well. Have you a roommate?" "Yes, a deuce of a fellow who bolts out in the middle of the night and leaves doors open." Again the doctor glanced curiously at me. Then he lit the cigar and looked grave. "Did he come back?" he asked presently. "Yes, I was asleep, but I waked up and I heard him moving. Then I felt cold and went to sleep again. This morning I found the porthole open." "Look here," said the doctor quietly. "I don't care much for this ship. I don't care a rap for her reputation. I tell you what I will do. I have a good-sized place up here. I will share it with you, though I don't know you from Adam." I was very much surprised at the proposition. I could not imagine why he should take such a sudden interest in my welfare. However, his manner as he spoke of the ship was peculiar. "You are a very good doctor," I said, "but really, I believe even now the cabin could be aired or cleaned out or something. Why do you not care for the ship?" "We are not superstitious in our profession, sir," replied the doctor, "but the sea makes people so. I don't want to prejudice you, and I don't want to frighten you, but if you will take my advice, you will move in here. I would as soon see you overboard," he added earnestly, "as know that you or any other man was to sleep in 105. "Good gracious, why?" I asked. "Just because on the last 3 trips, the people who have slept there actually have gone overboard," he answered gravely. The intelligence was startling and exceedingly unpleasant, I confess. I looked hard at the doctor to see whether he was making game of me, but he looked perfectly serious. I thanked him warmly for his offer, but I told him I intended to be the exception to the rule by which everyone who slept in that particular stateroom went overboard. He did not say much, but looked as grave as ever and hinted that before we got across, I should probably reconsider his proposal. In the course of time, we went to breakfast, at which only an inconsiderable numbers of passengers had assembled. I noticed that one or two of the officers who had breakfasted with us looked grave. After breakfast, I went into my stateroom in order to get a book. The curtains of the upper berth were still closely drawn. Not a word was to be heard. My roommate was probably still asleep. As I came out, I met the steward whose business it was to look after me. He whispered that the captain wanted to see me, then scuttled away down the passage as if very anxious to avoid any questions. I went towards the captain's cabin and found him waiting for me. "Sir," said he, "I want to ask a favor of you." I answered that I would do anything to oblige him. "Your roommate has disappeared," he said. "He is known to have turned in early last night. Did you notice anything extraordinary in his manner?" The question, coming as it did in exact confirmation of the fears the doctor had expressed half an hour earlier, staggered me. "You don't mean to say he has gone overboard?" I asked. "I fear he has," answered the captain. "This is the most extraordinary thing," I began. "Why?" he asked. "He is the fourth, then?" I exclaimed. In answer to another question from the captain, I explained, without mentioning the doctor, that I had heard the story concerning 105. He seemed very much annoyed at hearing that I knew of it. I told him what had happened in the night. "What you say," he replied, "coincides almost exactly with what was told me by the roommates of two of the other three. They bolt out of bed and run down the passage. Two of them were seen to go overboard by the watch. We stopped and lowered boats, but they were never found. Nobody, however, saw or heard the man who was lost last night, if he is really lost. The steward, who was a superstitious fellow perhaps and expected something to go wrong, went to look for him this morning and found his berth empty, but his clothes lying about just as he had left them. The steward was the only man on board who knew him by sight, and he has been searching everywhere for him. He's disappeared. Now, sir, I want to beg you not to mention the circumstance to any of the passengers. I don't want the ship to get a bad name, and nothing hangs about an ocean goer like stories of suicides. You shall have your choice of any of the officers' cabins you like, including my own, for the rest of the passage. Is that a fair bargain?" "Very," said I, "and I am much obliged to you. But since I am alone and have the stateroom by myself, I would rather not move. If the steward will take out the unfortunate man's things, I would as lieve stay where I am. I will not say anything about the matter, and I think I can promise you that I will not follow my roommate." The captain tried to dissuade me from my intention, but I preferred having a stateroom alone to being the chum of any officer on board. I do not know whether I acted foolishly, but if I had taken his advice, I should have nothing more to tell. There would have remained this disagreeable coincidence of several suicides occurring among the men who had slept in the same cabin, but that would have been the end of it. That was not the end of the matter, however, by any means. I obstinately made up my mind that I would not be disturbed by such tales, and I even went as far as to argue the question with the captain. There was something wrong with that stateroom, I said. It was rather damp. The porthole had been left open last night. My roommate might have been ill when he came on board, and he might have become delirious after he went to bed. He might even now be hiding somewhere on board and might be found later. The place ought to be aired, and the fastening on the port looked to. If the captain would give me leave, I would see that what I thought was necessary were done immediately. "Of course you have a right to stay where you are if you please," he replied rather petulantly, "but I wish you would turn out and let me lock the place up and be done with it." I did not see it in the same light and left the captain, after promising to be silent concerning the disappearance of my companion. The latter had no acquaintances on board and was not missed in the course of the day. Towards evening I met the doctor again, and he asked me whether I had changed my mind. I told him I had not. "Then you will before long," he said very gravely. We played whist in the evening, and I went to bed late. I will confess now that I felt a disagreeable sensation when I entered my stateroom. I could not help thinking of the tall man I had seen the previous night, who was now dead, drowned, tossing about in the long swell, 200 or 300 miles astern. His face rose very distinctly before me as I undressed, and I even went so far as to draw back the curtains of the upper berth, as to persuade myself that he was actually gone. I also bolted the door of the stateroom. Suddenly I became aware that the porthole was open and fastened back. This was more than I could stand. I hastily threw on my dressing gown and went in search of Robert, the steward of my passage. I was very angry, and when I found him, I dragged him roughly to the door of 105 and pushed him towards the open porthole. What the deuce do you mean, you scoundrel, by leaving that port open every night? Don't you know it is against the regulations? Don't you know that if the ship heeled and the water began to come in, 10 men could not shut it? I will report you to the captain, you blackguard, for endangering this ship. I was exceedingly wroth. The man trembled and turned pale, and then began to shut the round glass plate with heavy brass fittings. Why don't you answer me? I said roughly. If you please, sir, faltered Robert. There's nobody on board who can keep this airport shut at night. You can try it yourself, sir. It ain't going to stop any longer on board about this vessel. I ain't. But if I was you, I'd just clear out and go to sleep with the surgeon or something. I would. Look here, sir. Is that fastened what you may call securely or not, sir? Try it, sir. See if it'll move a hinge. I tried the port and found it perfectly tight. Well, sir, continued Robert triumphantly, I'll wager my reputation as an A1 steward that in off an hour it will be open again. Fastened back, too, sir. That's the orful thing. Fastened back. I examined the great screw and the looped nut that ran on it. If I find it open in the night, Robert, I will give you a sovereign. It is not possible. You may go. A sovereign, did you say, sir? Very good, sir. Thank ye, sir. Good night, sir. Pleasant repose, sir. And in all manner of enchanting dreams, sir. Robert scuttled away, delighted at being released. Of course, I thought he was trying to account for his negligence by a silly story, intended to frighten me, and I disbelieved him. The consequence was that he got his sovereign, and I spent a very peculiarly unpleasant night. I went to bed, and 5 minutes after I had rolled myself up in my blankets, the inexorable Robert extinguished the light that burned steadily behind the round glass pane near the door. I lay quite still in the dark, trying to go to sleep, but I soon found it impossible. It had been some satisfaction to be angry with the steward, and the diversion had banished that very unpleasant sensation that I had first experienced when I thought of the drowned man who had been my chum. But I was no longer sleepy, and I lay awake for some time, occasionally glancing at the porthole, which I could just see from where I lay, and which in the darkness looked like a faintly luminous soup plate suspended in the blackness. I believe I must have lain there for an hour, and as I remember, I was just dozing into sleep when I was roused by a draught of cold air and by distinctly feeling the spray of the sea blown upon my face. I started to my feet, and not having allowed in the dark for the motion of the ship, I was instantly thrown violently across the stateroom upon the couch which was placed beneath the porthole. I recovered myself immediately, however, and climbed upon my knees. The porthole was again wide open and fastened back. Now these things are facts. I was wide awake when I got up, and I should have certainly been waked by the fall had I still been dozing. Moreover, I bruised my elbows and knees badly, and the bruises were there on the following morning to testify to the fact, if I myself had doubted it. The porthole was wide open and fastened back, a thing so unaccountable that I remember very well feeling astonishment rather than fear when I discovered it. I at once closed the plate again and screwed down the loop nut with all my strength. It was very dark in the stateroom. I reflected that the port had certainly been opened within an hour after Robert had first shut it in my presence, and I determined to watch it to see whether it would open again. Those brass fittings are very heavy and by no means easy to move. I could not believe that the clamp had been turned by the shaking of the screw. I stood peering out through the thick glass at the alternate white and gray streaks of the sea that foamed beneath the ship's side. I must have remained there a quarter of an hour. Suddenly, as I stood, I distinctly heard something moving behind me in one of the berths, and a moment afterwards, just as I turned instinctively to look, though I could, of course, see nothing in the darkness, I heard a very faint groan. I sprang across the stateroom and tore open the curtains of the upper booth, thrusting my hands in to discover if there was anything there. There was someone. I remember that sensation as I put my hands forward, as though I was plunging them into the air of a damp cellar. And from behind the curtains came a gust of wind that smelled horribly of stagnant seawater. I laid hold of something that had the shape of a man's arm but was smooth and wet and icy cold. Suddenly, as I pulled, the creature sprang violently towards me, a clammy, oozy mass as it seemed to me heavy and wet, yet endowed with a sort of supernatural strength. I reeled across the stateroom, and in an instant the door opened and the thing rushed out. I had not had time to be frightened, and quickly recovered myself. I sprang through the door and gave chase at the top of my speed, but I was too late. 10 yards before me I could see, I am sure of it, a dark shadow moving in the dimly lighted passage quickly as the shadow of a fast horse thrown before a dog cart by the lamp on a dark night. But in a moment it had disappeared, and I found myself holding onto the polished rail that ran along the bulkhead where the passage turned towards the companionway. My hair stood on end, and the cold perspiration rolled down my face. I am not ashamed of it in the least. I was very badly frightened. Still, I doubted my senses and pulled myself together. It was absurd, I thought. The Welsh rare bit that I had eaten disagreed with me. It had been a nightmare. I made my way back to the stateroom and entered it with an effort. The whole place smelled of stagnant seawater, as it had when I had walked on the previous evening. It required my utmost strength to go in and grope among my things for a box of wax lights. As I lighted a railway reading lantern, which I always carry in case I want to read after the lamps are out, I perceived that the porthole was again open, and a sort of creeping horror began to take possession of me which I had never felt before, nor wished to feel again. But I got a light and proceeded to examine the upper berth, expecting to find it drenched in seawater. But I was disappointed. The bed had been slept in, and the smell of sea was strong, but the bedding was as dry as a bone. I fancied that Robert had not had the courage to make the bed after the accident of the previous night. It had all been a hideous dream. I drew the curtains back as far as I could and examined the place very carefully. It was perfectly dry, but the porthole was open again. With a sort of dull bewilderment of horror, I closed it and screwed it down, and thrusting my heavy stick through the brass loop, wrenched it with all my might until the thick metal began to bend under the pressure. Then I hooked my reading lantern into the red velvet at the head of the couch and sat down to recover my senses, if I could. I sat there all night, unable to think of rest, hardly able to think at all. But the porthole remained closed, and I did not believe it would open now again without the application of a considerable force. The morning dawned at last, and I dressed myself slowly. Thinking over all that had happened in the night, it was a beautiful day, and I went on deck, glad to get out into the early pure sunshine and smell the breeze from the blue water, so different from the noisome, stagnant odor of my stateroom. Instinctively, I turned aft, toward the surgeon's cabin. There he stood with a pipe in his mouth, taking his morning airing precisely as on the preceding day. "Good morning," he said quietly, but looking at me with an evident curiosity. "Doctor, you were quite right," said I. "There is something wrong about that place." "I thought you would change your mind," he answered rather triumphantly. "You have had a bad night, eh? Shall I make you a pick-me-up? I have a capital recipe." "No, thanks," I cried, "but I would like to tell you what happened." Then I tried to explain as clearly as possible precisely what had occurred, not omitting to state that I had been scared as I had never been scared my whole life before. I dwelt particularly on the phenomena of the porthole, which was a fact to which I could testify, even if the rest had been an illusion. I had closed it twice in the night, and the second time I had actually bent the brass and wrenching it with my stick. I believed I insisted a good deal on this point. "You seem to think that I am likely to doubt the story," said the doctor, smiling at my detailed account of the state of the porthole. "I do not doubt in the least. I renew my invitation to you. Bring your traps here and take half of my cabin." "No, come take half of mine for one night," I said. "Help me get to the bottom of this thing." "You will get to the bottom of something else if you try," answered the doctor. "What?" I asked. "The bottom of the sea. I am going to leave this ship. It is not canny." "Then you will not help me find out?" "Not I," said the doctor quickly. "It is my business to keep my wits about me, not to go fiddling about with ghosts and things." "Do you really believe it's a ghost?" I inquired rather contemptuously. But as I spoke, I remembered very well the horrible sensation of the supernatural which had got possession of me during the night. The doctor turned sharply on me. "Have you any reasonable explanation of these things to offer?" he asked. "No, you have not." "Well, you say you will find an explanation. I say that you won't, sir, simply because there isn't any." But my dear sir, I retorted, do you, a man of science, mean to tell me that such things cannot be explained? I do, he answered softly, and if they could, I would not be concerned in the explanation. I did not care to spend another night alone in the stateroom, and yet I was obstinately determined to get at the root of the disturbances. I do not believe there are many men who have slept there alone after passing through such nights. But I made up my mind to try it, if I could not get anyone to share the watch with me. The doctor was evidently not inclined for such an experiment. He said he was a surgeon, and that in case any accident occurred on board, he must always be in readiness. He could not afford to have his nerves unsettled. Perhaps he was right, but I'm inclined to think that his precaution was prompted by his inclination. On inquiry, he informed me that there was no one on board who would be likely to join me in my investigations, and after a little more conversation, I left him. A little later, I met the captain and told him my story. I said that if no one would spend the night with me, I would ask leave to have the light left burning all night and would try it alone. Look here, he said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will share your watch myself and we'll see what happens. It is my belief that we can find out between us. There may be some fellow skulking on board who steals a passage by frightening the passengers. It is just possible that there may be something queer in the carpentering of that berth. I suggested taking the ship's carpenter below and examining the place, but I was overjoyed at the captain's offer to spend the night with me. He accordingly sent for the workman and ordered him to do anything I required. We went below at once. I had all the bedding cleared out of the upper berth, and we examined the place thoroughly to see if there was a board loose anywhere or a panel which could be opened or pushed aside. We tried the planks everywhere, tapped the flooring, unscrewed the fittings of the lower berth, and took it to pieces. In short, there was not a square inch of the stateroom which was not searched and tested. Everything was in perfect order, and we put everything back in its place. As we were finishing our work, Robert came to the door and looked in. Well, sir, find anything, sir? He asked, with a ghastly grin. You were right about the porthole, Robert, I said, and I gave him the promised sovereign. The carpenter did his work silently and skillfully, following my directions. When he was done, he spoke. I'm a plain man, sir, he said, but it's my belief you had better just turn out your things and let me run a half-dozen 4-inch screws through the door of this cabin. There's no good ever came to this cabin, sir, and that's all about it. There's been 4 lives lost out here to my own remembrance, and that is just 4 trips. Better give it up, sir. You better give it up. I will try for 1 night more, I said. Better give it up, sir. Better give it up. It's a precious bad job, repeated the workman, putting his tools in his bag and leaving the cabin. But my spirits had risen considerably at the prospect of having the captain's company, and I made up my mind not to be prevented from going to the end of the strange business. I abstained from the Welsh rarebits and the grog that evening and did not even join in the customary game of whist. I wanted to be quite sure of my nerves, and my vanity made me anxious to make a good figure in the captain's eyes. The captain was one of those splendidly tough and cheerful specimens of seafaring humanity whose combined courage, hardihood, and calmness in difficulty leads them naturally into high positions of trust. He was not the man to be led away by an idle tale, and the mere fact that he was willing to join me in the investigation was proof that he thought that there was seriously something wrong, which could not be accounted for by ordinary theories, nor laughed down as a common superstition. To some extent, too, his reputation was at stake, as well as the reputation of the ship. It is no light thing to lose passengers overboard, and he knew it. About 10 o'clock that evening, as I was smoking the last cigar, he came up to me and drew me aside from the beat of the other passengers who were patrolling the deck in the warm darkness. This is a serious matter, Mr. Brisbane, he said. We must make up our minds either way, to be disappointed or to have a pretty rough time of it. You see, I cannot afford to laugh at the affair, and I will ask you to sign your name to a statement of whatever occurs. If nothing happens tonight, we will try it again tomorrow and the next day. Are you ready? Supposing we put your portmanteau before the door, he suggested. One of us can sit on it. Nothing can get out then. Is the port screwed down? I found it as I had left it in the morning. Indeed, without using a lever as I had done, no one could have opened it. I drew back the curtains of the upper berth so that I could see well into it. By the captain's advice, I lighted my reading lantern and placed it so that it shone upon the white sheets above. He insisted upon sitting on the portmanteau, declaring that he wished to be able to swear that he had sat before the door. Then he requested me to search the stateroom thoroughly, an operation very soon accomplished, as it consisted merely in looking beneath the lower berth and under the couch below the porthole. The spaces were quite empty. "It is impossible for any human being to get in," I said, "or for any human being to open the port." "Very good," said the captain calmly. "If we see anything now, it must be either imagination or something supernatural." I sat down on the edge of the lower berth. "The first time it happened," said the captain, crossing his legs and leaning back against the door, "was in March. The passenger who slept here in the upper berth turned out to have been a lunatic. At all events, he was known to have been a little touched, and he had taken passage without the knowledge of his friends. He rushed out in the middle of the night and threw himself overboard before the officer who had the watch could stop him. We stopped and lowered a boat. It was a quiet night, just before that heavy weather came on, but we could not find him. Of course, his suicide was afterwards accounted for on the grounds of insanity." "I suppose that often happens," I remarked rather absently. "Not often, no," said the captain. "Never before in my experience, though I have heard of it happening on board of other ships. Well, as I was saying, that occurred in March. On the very next trip—" "What are you looking at?" he asked, stopping suddenly in his narration. I believe I gave no answer. My eyes were riveted upon the porthole. It seemed to me that the brass loop nut was beginning to turn very slowly upon the screw. So slowly, however, that I was not sure it moved at all. I watched it intensely, fixing its position in my mind and trying to ascertain whether it changed. Seeing where I was looking, the captain looked too. "It moves!" he exclaimed, in a tone of conviction. No, it does not," he added after a minute. "If it were the jarring of the screw," said I, "it would have opened during the day, but I found it this evening jammed tight as I had left it this morning." I rose and tried the nut. It was certainly loosened, for by an effort I could move it with my hands. "The queer thing," the captain said, "is that the second man who was lost is supposed to have gone through that very port. We had a terrible time over it. It was in the middle of the night and the weather was very heavy. There was an alarm that one of the ports was open and the sea running in. I came below and found everything flooded, the water pouring in every time she rolled, and the whole port swinging from the top bolts, not the porthole in the middle. Well, we managed to shut it, but the water did some damage. Ever since then, the place smells of seawater from time to time. We supposed the passenger had thrown himself out, though Lord only knows how he did it. The steward kept telling me that he cannot keep anything shut here. Upon my word, I can smell it now, cannot you?" he inquired, sniffing the air suspiciously. "Yes, distinctly," I said, and I shuddered as that same odor of stagnant seawater grew stronger in the cabin. "Now, to smell like this, the place must be damp," I continued, "and yet, when I examined it with the carpenter this morning, everything was perfectly dry. It is most extraordinary." My reading lantern, which had been placed in the upper berth, was suddenly extinguished. There was still a good deal of light from the pane of ground glass near the door, behind which loomed a regulation lamp. The ship rolled heavily, and the curtain of the berth swung far out into the stateroom and back again. I rose quickly from my seat on the edge of the bed, and the captain at the same moment started to his feet with a loud cry of surprise. Turned with the intention of taking the lantern down to examine it when I heard his exclamation and immediately afterwards his call for help. I sprang towards him. He was wrestling with all his might against the brass loop of the port. It seemed to turn against his hands in spite of all of his efforts. I caught at my cane, a heavy oak stick I always used to carry, and thrust it through the ring and bore on it with all my strength. But the strong wood snapped suddenly and I fell upon the couch. When I rose again, the port was wide open, and the captain was standing with his back against the door, pale to the lips. "There was something in that berth," he cried in a strange voice, his eyes almost staring from his head. "Hold the door while I look. It shall not escape us, whatever it is." But instead of taking his place, I sprang upon the lower bed and seized something which lay upon the upper berth. It was something ghostly, horrible beyond words, and it moved in my grip. It was like the body of a man long drowned, and yet it moved. And it had the strength of 10 men living, but I gripped it with all my might. The slippery, oozy, horrible thing. The dead white eyes seemed to stare at me out of the dusk. The putrid odor of rank seawater was about it, and its shiny hair and its shiny hair hung in foul wet curls over its dead face. I wrestled with the dead thing. It thrust itself upon me and forced me back and nearly broke my arms. It wound its corpse's arms about my neck, the living death, and overpowered me so that I at last cried aloud and fell and left my hold. As I fell, the thing sprang across me and seemed to throw itself upon the captain. When I last saw him on his feet, his face was white and his lips set. It seemed to me that he struck a violent blow at the dead thing, and then he too fell forward upon his face, with an inarticulate cry of horror. The thing paused an instant, seemed to hover over his prostrate body, and I could have screamed again for the very fright, but I had no voice left. The thing vanished suddenly, and it seemed to my disturbed senses that it made its exit through the open port, though how that was possible, considering the smallness of the aperture, is more than anyone can tell. I lay a long time on the floor, and the captain lay beside me. At last, I partially recovered my senses and moved, and instantly I knew that my arm was broken, the small bone of my left forearm near the wrist. I got upon my feet somehow, and with my remaining hand I tried to raise the captain. He groaned and moved, and at last came to himself. He was not hurt, but he seemed badly stunned. Well, do you want to hear any more? There is nothing more, for that is the end of my story. The carpenter carried out his scheme of running a half a dozen 4-inch screws through the door of 105, and if you ever take passage in the Kamchatka, you may ask for a berth in that stateroom. You will be told that it is engaged. Yes, it is engaged by that dead thing. I finished the trip in the surgeon's cabin. He doctored my broken arm and advised me not to fiddle about with ghosts and things anymore. The captain was very silent and never sailed again in that ship, though it is still running. And I will not sail in her either. It was a very disagreeable experience, and I was very badly frightened, which is a thing I do not like. That is all. That is how I saw a ghost, if it was a ghost. It was dead, anyhow. Happy Halloween, and thanks for watching 1834 Restoration House.